Betrayed by the only family she ever knew, cast into the frozen wastelands to die for the crime of being wolfless. She was meant to be a forgotten tragedy. Instead, she became a legend. Watch how a rejected outcast returned as the most terrifying, majestic creature their medieval world had ever seen. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets outside the iron-wrought windows of the great hall, but inside the air was thick with the suffocating heat of 1,000 gathered bodies, torches cast flickering erratic shadows against the ancient stone walls of Ethelgard, illuminating the faded tapestries of great wolves tearing through the flesh of their enemies. It was the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred evening in the kingdom's calendar. It was the night of the shifting ceremony. Isolde Harrington stood at the center of the obsidian floor, her thin linen dress offering no protection against the biting draughts that slithered through the hall. She was 18, the age when the wolf spirit was meant to claw its way out of the human vessel, claiming its rightful place in the hierarchy of King Alaric Montgomery's pack. Around her, the murmurs of the nobility sounded like the buzzing of a disturbed hive. To her left stood Lord Henry Harrington, her adoptive father. His face, weathered by years of war and political maneuvering, was a mask of barely concealed rage. For years, the Harrington family had maintained their status as the king's most elite warriors. To harbor a runt, a wolfless girl, was a stain on their impeccable lineage. Seated upon the raised dais, carved from the skull of a monstrous, long-dead bear, was King Alaric Montgomery. He was a terrifying vision of medieval royalty, draped in heavy furs, his piercing silver eyes locked onto Isolde. They had been childhood companions once before. The crown had hardened his heart, and the alpha blood had turned him into a ruthless ruler. Now he looked at her, not with the warmth of their youth, but with the cold, calculating stare of a king weighing a liability. The moon has reached its zenith. Alaric's voice boomed, silencing the hall instantly. The sound vibrated through the stone floor, a testament to the raw alpha power coursing through his veins. Isolde of House Harrington, yield to the moon. Call forth your beast. Isolde closed her eyes, her chest heaving as panic tightened its grip around her lungs. She reached deep inside her soul, searching for the primal spark, the growl, the scratching at the edges of her consciousness that the elders always described. She felt nothing but the frantic fluttering of her own human heart. She squeezed her eyes shut tighter, dropping to her knees on the freezing obsidian, forcing every ounce of her willpower toward a transformation that stubbornly refused to come. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The heavy silence in the great hall slowly fractured, breaking into whispers, then scoffs, and finally outright laughter. "A hollow vessel," sneered Lady Seraphina Croft, her voice slicing through the noise. Seraphina was a striking woman with raven hair and a viciously cunning mind, desperately maneuvering to become Alaric's queen. She stepped forward, her silk skirts sweeping over the stone. "She possesses no wolf, my king. She is an empty shell, a mockery of our sacred bloodline." Isolde opened her eyes, tears of humiliation burning her cheeks. She looked up at Lord Henry, pleading silently for intervention, for a single word of defense. Instead, her adoptive father turned his back to her, a gesture of absolute disownment. The collective gasp from the crowd sealed her fate. To be turned upon by one's own house was a social execution. "The law of Ethelgard is written in the blood of our ancestors," Seraphina continued, pacing like a predator, circling wounded prey. "A wolfless born to the nobility is a curse upon the pack's magic. She will draw sickness to our crops and weakness to our warriors." The decree for such an abomination is absolute." Alaric's jaw clenched. Isolde saw the minute twitch of a muscle in his cheek, the only betraying sign of the conflict raging beneath his icy exterior. He gripped the armrests of his throne, his silver eyes flashing with a dangerous amber light. For a fleeting second, Isolde prayed he would defy the archaic laws, that he would remember the girl who used to bandage his wooden sword injuries in the castle gardens. "The law is absolute." Alaric finally spoke, his voice devoid of all emotion. The words struck Isolde like a physical blow. "Isolde Harrington, you have failed to present your wolf. You are deemed broken. By the power vested in me as Alpha King, you are stripped of your name, your titles, and your protection. You are hereby banished to the Whispering Wastes." A collective cheer erupted from the Croft loyalists. The Whispering Wastes were a sprawling, desolate tundra to the north, completely uninhabitable and crawling with feral rogues. Banishment there was not an exile. It was a death sentence. 2 armored guards seized Isolde by the arms, dragging her to her feet. She did not scream. She did not beg. A sudden numbing clarity washed over her. As they stripped the heavy winter cloak from her shoulders, leaving her only in her thin linen shift, she locked eyes with King Alaric one last time. She saw him look away first. The heavy oak doors of the great hall were thrown open, revealing the howling blizzard outside. The guards shoved her violently into the storm, and the doors slammed shut behind her, the boom echoing like the final beat of a dying heart. She was alone in the frozen dark. Survival in the Whispering Wastes was not a matter of skill for a human. It was an impossibility. For 3 days, Isolde wandered through the blinding white oblivion. Her bare feet had long since turned black with frostbite, leaving a trail of bloody footprints in the deep powder. The wind whipped her hair into frozen ropes that lashed against her pale, hollowed cheeks. She survived only by clinging to a primal, unexplainable instinct. She dug burrows in the snowbanks to avoid the lethal night winds and chewed on the bitter bark of dead pine trees. But the cold was not the true danger of the wastes. It was what hunted in the cold. On the evening of the 4th day, the blizzard finally broke, revealing a night sky so clear it looked like shattered glass. And rising above the jagged peaks of the northern mountains was a massive, swollen moon. It was not the pale silver of Ethelgard. It was a deep, violently crimson red. A blood moon. Isolde collapsed against the base of a frozen oak tree, her breathing shallow and ragged. She could feel her organs failing, her blood turning to slush in her veins. Death was minutes away, but as her eyes drifted shut, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the clearing. She forced her eyes open. Emerging from the tree line were 3 massive wolves. They were rogues, their fur matted with dried blood and filth, their eyes glowing with a sickly, starved yellow light. They fanned out, recognizing her not as a threat, but as an easy, albeit meager meal. The largest of the 3, a scarred brute missing half an ear, lunged forward, with its jaws snapping toward her throat. Isolde braced for the tearing of flesh, but the pain that erupted within her didn't come from the rogue's teeth. It exploded from her own marrow. A scream tore from her throat, a sound so inhuman, so deafening, that it caused the lunging rogue to falter and crash into the snow beside her. Her spine arched backward at a sickening angle. The sound of her own bones snapping and grinding echoed through the silent forest. But it wasn't the sound of destruction. It was the sound of violent restructuring. The crimson light of the blood moon seemed to physically pour into her, igniting her veins with liquid fire. The elders of Ethelgard had been wrong. Isolde wasn't wolfless because she was an empty vessel. She was wolfless because the entity inside her was too ancient, too colossally powerful to be summoned by a standard silver moon. It required the cosmic alignment of a blood moon and the absolute brink of death to tear its way into the mortal realm. White fur, luminescent and pristine as freshly fallen snow, erupted from her skin. Her limbs elongated thick with corded, unnatural muscle. Her jaw fractured and extended, filling with rows of razor-sharp obsidian teeth. When the transformation was complete, she did not stand on 4 legs. She rose on 2. She stood 8 feet tall, a towering bipedal nightmare of muscle claws and blinding white fur. She was not a werewolf. She was a Lycan, and not just any Lycan. The glowing, icy blue of her irises marked her as a White Lycan, a royal bloodline thought to have been eradicated centuries ago by the ancestors of King Alaric. The 3 rogues, previously intent on a meal, now cowered in the snow, whimpering as the primal aura of the ancient beast crushed the air from their lungs. The White Lycan looked down at her massive clawed hands, flexing them. The human consciousness of Isolde remained perfectly intact, fused seamlessly with the devastating intelligence and power of the Lycan. The scarred rogue, driven mad by panic, made a desperate leap at her. Isolde didn't even flinch. With a casual, almost lazy swipe of her massive arm, her claws cleaved through the air. The rogue was thrown 30 feet into the trunk of a pine tree, its spine shattered instantly. The other 2 didn't hesitate. They scrambled over each other, fleeing into the darkness, with their tails tucked firmly between their legs. Isolde threw her head back and unleashed a roar that shook the very foundations of the Whispering Wastes. It was a sound of absolute dominance, a declaration of survival, and a promise of vengeance. 2 years passed. The kingdom of Ethelgard had grown weak. Without the legendary magic of the Harrington bloodline to anchor their defenses, and with King Alaric growing increasingly paranoid under the manipulative whispers of Seraphina Croft, the kingdom was failing. But their internal politics were nothing compared to the threat brewing in the north. Reports began flooding into Alaric's court of a massive rogue army marching southward. But these were not the starved, feral creatures of the past. They were organized. They were disciplined. They were fleeing something terrifying. Refugees spoke in hushed, terrified whispers of the ghost of the wastes, a towering, snow-white monster that hunted on 2 legs, a creature that slaughtered entire packs of rogues with impunity, claiming the wastes as her own sovereign territory. Sitting upon his bone throne, Alaric listened to Commander Rowan Mercer, his most trusted scout, deliver the grim news. The rogue army will breach the iron gates of Ethelgard by the next full moon, king. Rowan reported, his face pale. We do not have the numbers to repel them. But the rogues, they are not marching to conquer us. They are being driven into our lands. They are running from her. Alaric leaned forward, his silver eyes narrowed. From a myth, a ghost story invented by terrified peasants. It is no myth, sire, Rowan said, stepping forward and dropping a massive severed rogue head onto the great hall's floor. The cut was impossibly clean, clearly done by a single swipe of a massive claw. I saw her with my own eyes. She commands the winter itself. If she breaches our walls, she will not just defeat the rogues. She will take the crown. Hundreds of miles away, standing atop a glacial cliff looking south toward the kingdom that had discarded her Isolde, let the freezing wind ripple through her magnificent white fur. She had mastered the beast. She had conquered the wastes. Now it was time to reclaim what was hers. Not to serve the Alpha King, but to replace him. Winter winds screamed against the ancient battlements of Ethelgard, but they were entirely drowned out by the deafening cacophony of war. Horns blared in frantic succession from the northern watchtowers, their brassy notes slicing through the freezing midnight air. The rogue army had arrived, and they numbered in the thousands. They moved not as a mindless horde, but with a terrifying, synchronized desperation, driven by the absolute terror of what stalked them in the frozen tundra behind. Standing atop the primary gatehouse, General Theodore Ashford wiped a mixture of sleet and sweat from his brow. He was a veteran of countless skirmishes, a man whose loyalty to the crown was etched into the deep scars across his jaw, but the sight below made his blood run completely cold. A sea of matted fur, yellow eyes, and gnashing teeth crashed against the reinforced iron gates. The sheer weight of the rogue bodies was buckling the heavy oak support beams. "Pour the pitch!" Theodore roared over the din, his voice cracking. "Archers loose on my command. Do not let them breach the perimeter." Flaming arrows rained down, illuminating the carnage in hellish bursts of orange and red, but the rogues barely flinched. They climbed over the burning corpses of their own kind, their minds fractured by panic. At the center of the rogue vanguard stood their leader, a colossal, soot-stained werewolf, known previously in human lands as Jackson Cole. He was a notorious criminal who had gathered the worst dregs of the wilderness, and now he threw his massive weight against the failing gates with rhythmic, earth-shattering thuds. Inside the royal keep, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of panic and cowardice. Lady Seraphina Croft, the orchestrator of Isolde's downfall, was not standing by her king. Instead, she was frantically tearing through her velvet-lined mahogany wardrobes, hurling heavy gold necklaces and jeweled tiaras into a leather satchel. Her lady-in-waiting, Rosalind Hayes, wept openly in the corner of the lavish chambers. "Pack faster, you useless girl!" Seraphina hissed, her normally composed face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer survival instinct. "The outer walls are failing. Alaric's forces are pathetic. I will not be torn apart by filthy scavengers, because our Alpha is too weak to hold his own territory." King Alaric Montgomery was already in the lower courtyard, his silver armor glinting under the chaotic torchlight. He had unsheathed his ancestral broadsword, a magnificent weapon forged from star metal, but his hands trembled imperceptibly. He could feel the panic of his pack through the Alpha bond, a sickening collective dread that eroded his own confidence. He had spent years isolating his strongest allies, prioritizing absolute obedience over tactical brilliance, and now the fatal flaw in his leadership was laid bare for the world to witness. With a sickening metallic screech that tore through the night, the main hinges of the northern gate snapped. The heavy iron doors collapsed inward, crushing a dozen royal guards beneath tons of steel and wood. The rogues poured into the courtyard like a tidal wave of disease and fury. Jackson Cole shifted mid-stride, his human form ripping apart into a monstrous, scarred brown wolf. He barreled straight toward the royal defender's jaws, snapping, sending armored men flying like discarded ragdolls. The clash of steel against claws, the agonizing screams of the dying, and the metallic scent of fresh carnage overwhelmed the senses. Alaric shifted his massive grey wolf form, meeting Jackson in a brutal, head-on collision that shook the cobblestones. But Alaric was outnumbered, and the royal guards were breaking. General Theodore Ashford fought valiantly, his spear piercing through rogue after rogue, but the tide was insurmountable. The kingdom was falling. The sacred obsidian floors of the great hall would soon be washed in the blood of the Montgomery line. Then the temperature in the courtyard plummeted. It was not a natural winter chill. This was a profound, suffocating freeze that seemed to sap the very heat from the roaring fires. The flames atop the braziers flickered frantically before turning a haunting, unnatural shade of icy blue. The frantic battle abruptly ground to a halt as a profound primal terror seized every living creature within the walls. The rogues whimpered their aggression, instantly replaced by the overwhelming instinct to submit. The true sovereign of the wild does not beg for the moon. The moon bends to her command. The ancient proverb, long forgotten by the scribes of Ethelgard, seemed to echo through the sudden deathly silence. High above the breached gatehouse, standing atop the crumbling stone archway, was a silhouette that defied all logic and reason. Isolde Harrington had returned. She stood towering in her lichen form, 8 feet of pure, terrifying majesty. Her fur was a blinding, iridescent white, shimmering under the moonlight like crystallized frost. She breathed out a heavy cloud of mist pluming from her elongated, deadly jaws, her eyes glowing with a piercing, luminescent blue fire locked onto the chaotic mass of wolves in the courtyard below. Jackson Cole, the rogue leader, recognized her instantly. The same monster that had hunted his kind across the whispering wastes. He let out a pathetic whimper, backing away from Alaric, his tail firmly tucked. Isolde did not hesitate. She dropped from the 70-foot wall landing in the center of the courtyard with a colossal impact that cracked the stone foundation. The shockwave knocked dozens of rogues entirely off their feet. She rose to her full height, her massive, corded muscles flexing as she let out a roar, a sound so deeply ancient and dominant that it forced every werewolf in the vicinity, including King Alaric, to their knees. The sheer kinetic force of her presence was paralyzing. The siege was over. The slaughter was about to begin, but not by the rogues. Carnage unfolded with terrifying surgical precision. Isolde did not fight like a mindless beast. She fought with the tactical brilliance of a warrior and the unstoppable force of a natural disaster. She tore through the rogue vanguard, her obsidian claws slicing through flesh, bone, and armor with zero resistance. Jackson Cole attempted to rally his remaining forces, lunging at her blind spot. Isolde caught him mid-air by the throat with one massive hand. With a sickening crunch, she crushed his windpipe and hurled his lifeless body into the remnants of the broken iron gates. Witnessing the effortless execution of their alpha, the remaining rogues broke completely. They scrambled desperately to escape the courtyard, trampling one another in their frenzied haste to flee back into the frozen wilderness. Within minutes, the courtyard was entirely clear of the invading threat, leaving only the dead, the dying, and the stunned survivors of the King's Guard. The White Lycan stood amidst the ruins, her pristine fur completely unblemished by the chaos. Slowly, the glowing blue fire in her eyes began to dim. The horrifying snapping of bones echoed once more as she began her regression. The massive, towering beast shrank further, receding into pale skin, elongated limbs, snapping back into human proportions. When the transformation concluded, Isolde stood in the center of the royal courtyard. She was completely naked, completely unashamed, and breathtakingly lethal. She was no longer the fragile, terrified girl they had thrown into the blizzard. She was a woman hardened by absolute survival, her skin bearing the faint, silvery scars of her battles in the wastes, her posture radiating absolute, unquestionable dominance. Captain Nathaniel Reed, a young officer who had survived the breach, instantly stripped off his heavy, fur-lined commander's cloak. Averting his eyes respectfully, he approached and draped it over her shoulders. Isolde pulled the heavy fabric around herself, her piercing gaze sweeping over the kneeling guards until it locked onto the raised stone steps of the keep. King Alaric had shifted back to his human form. He was bruised, bleeding from a deep gash on his shoulder, and staring at Isolde with a mixture of absolute awe and profound dread. Beside him, dragged out of the keep by 2 royal guards for her attempted desertion, was Seraphina Croft, and cowering in the shadows of the portico was Lord Henry Harrington, the man who had cast Isolde out. Isolde. Alaric breathed his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the dead silence of the courtyard. Do not address me with the familiarity of an equal, Alaric. Isolde's voice rang out cold and unyielding. It was completely void of the warmth she had once harbored for him. You lost that right the moment you condemned me to the ice. She walked slowly up the blood-slicked steps. The royal guards instinctively parted for her, lowering their weapons. They recognized the true Alpha. Lord Henry Harrington fell to his knees, his face pale with terror. Isolde, my child, you survived. The gods have shown mercy. There was no mercy in the wastes. Henry, Isolde interrupted, her eyes narrowing. Only survival. Tell the king the truth. Tell him why you adopted me, only to disown me the moment the court turned against me. Henry trembled violently, looking between the imposing figure of the king and the terrifying woman before him. I found you in the ruins of the northern craters, the old Lycan settlement. There was a prophecy. A White Lycan would rise to cleanse the tainted bloodlines of Ethelgard. I took you in to control you, to hide you from the crown. But when you failed to shift under the silver moon, I thought I was wrong. I thought you were just a human runt. If I had defended you, the king would have looked closer at your origins. You were a coward, Isolde stated coldly, rendering her final judgment. You are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your name. You will walk into the wastes tomorrow at dawn, just as you forced me to do. We will see if you find the same mercy. Seraphina Croft, driven entirely mad by the collapse of her carefully constructed world, suddenly lunged forward. She had slipped a small poisoned silver dagger from her bodice, aiming directly for Isolde's chest. "You are an abomination!" she shrieked. Isolde didn't even blink. With blinding speed, her hand shot out, catching Seraphina's wrist. The sound of fracturing bone echoed loudly. Seraphina screamed, dropping the dagger as Isolde effortlessly tossed her down the stone steps. "Lock her in the deepest dungeon," Isolde commanded the guards. "Let her rot in the darkness she so desperately tried to cast me into." Finally, Isolde turned her full attention to King Alaric. He stood tall, though the alpha aura he had relied on for years was entirely suppressed by her overwhelming presence. "I broke the ancient laws," Alaric admitted, his voice tight with regret. "I let fear and manipulation blind me to the truth. I betrayed you, Isolde. By the laws of the pack, my life is forfeit to you. Take your vengeance." He knelt, bowing his head, exposing his throat to her. Isolde stared down at the man who had shattered her heart. She could kill him. It would be easy. But true power was not just in destruction. It was in absolute subjugation. "Your death would be a quick release, Alaric," Isolde said softly, her voice echoing with the dual resonance of her Lycan spirit. "You will live. You will live as a soldier in my vanguard. You will fight to rebuild the walls you allowed to fall, and you will watch every single day as I rule the kingdom you nearly destroyed." She reached out and pulled the heavy iron-wrought crown from his bowed head. Turning to face the stunned, bruised, and bloody survivors of the kingdom, Isolde Harrington, the last White Lycan, raised the crown high into the freezing night air. A deafening, unified howl of absolute loyalty erupted from the courtyard, welcoming the dawn of a terrifying, magnificent new era. If you were captivated by Isolde's epic journey from a rejected outcast to the majestic Lycan queen, make sure to hit that like button, share this incredible story of betrayal, power, and ultimate vengeance with your friends who love fantasy and werewolf lore. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling original audio dramas and epic sagas every single week. Leave a comment below on what you think King Alaric's fate should be.